Hi, this is Troy Norcross with SER Team. Today we're going to be speaking with Jonathan Jewell. He teaches at a multitude of universities and is constantly experimenting and innovating with all kinds of new software. Recently, he asked me a question on LinkedIn, and rather than giving him a 1 or 2 line answer, I invited him to come on the show and ask his question, and we could have an online discussion and debate. So without further ado, here's Troy and Jonathan. Hey everybody, this is Troy Norcross, and today I am joined by Jonathan Jewell. Jonathan is a lecturer at multiple universities, as well as doing consulting in innovation in a variety of areas. And before we actually started recording, he was telling me about all the amazing tools and software that he gets to play with. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me, Troy.
Great. So for the listeners, can you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Sure. I've worked in a range of roles. I started off as a children's nurse a long time ago. And I don't think I was particularly well suited to that role. My mind doesn't kind of work in the right way. I loved it. It was really important to me. But I ended up getting very involved in other aspects of organizations, how they work together, how people work together, how society's culture, things about innovation. I did some practice in the US and I saw different approaches over there. Since then, I basically, rather than looking to specialize in a very particular area, I've tried to specialize in breadth, sort of like see across boundaries. And part of the idea or problem that I was seeing was we do a lot of things in academia, which there is a silo story, which everybody kind of knows, the idea that we're all working in different compartments. But there's another level to which we produce this stuff, which is very deep, very knowledgeable, very precise, but it doesn't turn into practice. And so the area of most interest to me has been this theory, they call this in nursing, they call it the theory practice gap or the theory.
Okay.
There's been a lot of research into how that happens, because obviously within medicine and healthcare, that needs to be really, that's a very important thing that actually is going to affect life, death, outcomes. But I guess I've spent longer time getting to know different subject areas and seeing different perspectives and ways that they work. So at the moment, I teach at various institutions. I teach within business, and I teach things which might be associated with like different areas of organizational strategy, things to do with innovation. So I'm doing that kind of stuff. We're teaching economics over at places like Fashion Retail Academy and the University of Arts. At the same time, I've been teaching very recently mechatronics with people over at Middlesex, and I've been teaching childhood and youth studies because of my long background history working in developmental psychology and the stuff to do with children. Other places, I'm teaching currently data science, and I'm teaching computing introductions and producing a series on various different types of technology which are close by and technology which is further away. And I guess what I'm trying to sort of like see is look at multiple paradigms, see in which the ways in which these interact and the crossover between these areas, and try to be aware enough from studying. I have a master's in art theory and philosophy, and I have a master's in cognitive and decision science. There are other kinds of qualifications that I've looked at and tried to work with at different levels, but really try to understand, where are these intersections and which intersection explore first. So I'm coming from, as I say, quite a different perspective, I guess, in that I move between universities, subject areas, and it's the theory practice gap, which is where I want to understand things. I guess that's where the question came up, because there's got to be a sense to which recognize that, boundaries are permeable, and I can spend some time in each of the areas, and I can give some depth to each of the areas, but there's got to be a handover point where I actually say, is that really the case? And so, yes, that's where our meeting, I guess, came out of.
And one of those areas, and you didn't mention it expressly, happened to be blockchain, right? So what are you doing in blockchain?
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm very interested in blockchain as a technology. I'm also very aware that when people approach me, I had a approach from somebody the other day, and they brought up an issue that wasn't blockchain. And I was excited to hear this, because a lot of the time, blockchain having become a very exciting technology. I think there are very exciting things, and I've looked at some of the technologies behind it and some of the theory and some of the places it's being used and tried to make judgments on it. I do find that there's a big overuse and misapplication of blockchain particular situations. But there are other things which I think have been neglected in blockchain, in that we talk, obviously, and some Bitcoin's very exciting. And I think there's lots of other things about the clever mathematic, hash graph versus holochain, all these kinds of things. There are fascinating issues, but there are certain things that lie behind this all, which I think we don't talk about, which could potentially be have bigger ramifications for everyday life than perhaps that technology. I'm not debating that finance is an important thing, but in our lives, it's not necessarily, we might see a cash register or machine, which would be very, very interesting if we were to withdraw or transfer Bitcoin, but it's not the same thing as actually the things that ripple through the whole of the rest of our life, our society, and so on. So at the Open University, I teach an introduction to social sciences. I also teach subject material, which is to do with economics and social science. And I guess there was this one question that was really bothering me about the technology and how it was going to work with society and what the potential or the ramifications of that was.
Which leads us really nicely onto the question itself, which was, can we use blockchain to change the tide and the tried and true kind of situation of history is always written by the winners? So can you say more about the question and give us a bit more context to it, and then I'll give you my thoughts back.
Sure. I was on LinkedIn, and I've been looking at all the kinds of things that have been happening. And there was a very, very interesting quotation that was on about Donald Trump's legacy. And it was a quotation from a historian that said, those who try to, I forget the exact quotation, but those who choose to try and make an effort to, at the, in the very, very immediate frame, to make sure that they are remembered in history, are like butterflies that are pinned to a board. They're always going to sort of suffer and end up basically dying in its legacy. As I say, I wish I could remember the quotation exactly. So there are various different kinds of ways in which we see that history is written by particular groups, which then is recorded and runs throughout history and then needs to be shaped later. And the big discussions at the moment, obviously, not obviously, in the States have been about pulling down statues.
Yes.
The fights and the battles about pulling down statues. Who should we remember? Should we remember the Confederate traitors, as some groups will say? Should we acknowledge that our past was founded by, let's say, George Washington, but then George Washington might have been a slave owner, and so on, all these many kinds of different ways. Women who publish under men's names in history, oral lectures whose stuff isn't documented and therefore is not transmissible or has to be interpreted by someone in the meantime. So taking this phrase, history is written by the winners, those who are on top, maybe with the education, the transmission, own the institutions, the calls them the ideological state apparatus. So they own these things, and therefore they have a control and a command over history. And my question really was, I understand that blockchain has what I think you've called immutability, and in my head I call indelibility, the idea either way that you can't write it away. Once it's written down, it can't be written away. And this relates to another question, but for the moment, the question is really, if people can write, if they have the facility to write, that would be all the computers and access and all these things. And I accept that that's not 100% coverage, but it's a lot, it's a very, very large bulk. People can write, people can have this stored in a way that cannot be removed. Is there a question about whether or not history can be stopped, in a sense, that somebody can say, I am now, because I'm in charge, people who would say that they're in charge could say, I'm going to control history. I will not let this be written down. I will not let this be held, versus the new situation where you have this decentralized involving people who are able to write to it and which then cannot be unwritten. And I think the development of that question was, in the future, it won't be a case. This is my kind of thinking I had. In the future, the stuff will have been written. And actually, the only thing which will be able to stop people from having that history, from having their records be part of the present, would actually be the question of who can read or who is allowed to get access. And there's a number of points around there, but it's this interface between society and technology, and what the implications of this could be. History written by everybody what does that mean in terms of somebody who doesn't want bits of history to come out?
Right. So there's a whole lot to unpack in there. We're going to start at kind of the beginning with the word immutability or indelibility. So first, we're going to say blockchains. There are lots of different kinds of blockchains. The ones you're referring to are public and permissionless blockchains. That means that the blockchain itself is maintained by an unlimited number of individual computers or nodes and is truly decentralized as to who can read or write onto the blockchain. It is distributed, which means there are multiple copies of the blockchain held in multiple locations, which is good for high availability, and it is immutable. So immutable, rather than being indelible or permanent, it means tamper evident, which means that if somebody comes along and tries to change one of their copies of the blockchain, everyone's going to know that it's been changed. So once it's been written, it's confirmed, and it can't be changed without being evident that it's been tampered with. With the consensus mechanism across multiple nodes, especially when it comes to things like transfers of value, like cryptocurrencies, then the network itself also decides whether a transfer is a valid or an invalid transfer. And that becomes really relevant with what you're talking about, because history is just information, and blockchain is just a ledger. It's a place to record information. And if you have no controls over who can write the information, then anybody can write whatever they want. But the problem is, in most of the information, what are they writing? I would say you've got to have two things. You've got to have source and you've got to have context.
Right.
And that's really what has to be stored with every individual entry. According to whom and in what context. I always give a classic example. If I tell you the sky is black, most people will tell me that that's fake news because everyone knows the sky is blue. And I say, according to whom? Well, according to a non-sighted person, it may very well be black. Or in what context? If it's midnight, the sky is black. And so the first thing we have to do is not just write information into the blockchain, we have to write it with source and with context as attribution for those individual elements. Because a lot of people will take the way that they saw the event and put their lens on that event, and they will write history based on their lens, based on their perspective, based on their context. So now I've got a public permissionless blockchain. I can write, and anybody can write what they want on there, but who knows if it's true? Who knows if it's accurate? Who knows can understand how to interpret the information that's on there? So I think the first instance, yes, anybody can write onto it, but in order for the problem to be solved, you need source and you need context, you need attribution of those entries. Who can read it? Well, if it's a public blockchain, that's the beauty of a public blockchain. Everybody can read the information that's on the blockchain. So both sides of a historical event, whether that's a war, whether that's an attempt to pull down a statue, whether that's a tax increase or a vote that did or did not happen, was or was not accurate, both sides can record their perspectives, and one side doesn't get diminished, it doesn't get erased. And you can look at it over time, and in 20 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, somebody can say, oh, well, I'm assured that what was written on that day is the same thing that was written and what I'm reading today. Because if you put it into a database, if you put it into an online service, some hacker, some evil person could come along and edit it and change it and rewrite it. And as you look at the Wikipedia is constantly struggling with people going in and trying to rewrite history on Wikipedia because they can't. They can go in and edit it. So that's the first part of the answer. What do you think?
Well, the things that I'm thinking immediately are, well, there are two things. One of them is that I remember I went to a talk at the British Library with Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky, probably most people know, I won't get into sort of large amount of detail, but he said one of his concerns about the internet, the way in which the internet had managed to kind of like flourish, that made it not really that great an innovation. There is you can watch this at the British Library. It wasn't such a big innovation. The reason being because effectively anybody could write anything they wanted. In his words, it was just a giant library full of crap.
Right.
And that was his take on the internet. And so the first thought I had when you were saying that is, yeah, people can write giant libraries full of crap. You can just write and write and write. I think there's a statistic that says every day's data at this point in time, if you just look at the YouTube videos, it comes to about 80 years worth of content that is, if you were to watch each one after another. I think that's the statistic.
Amazing numbers. I
My
love
head.
that.
But that's an absolutely massive amount. And whatever it is, we know it's an absolutely massive amount, the stuff that's uploaded. And many people say, what's the point? You know, I had a debate about this, about academic journals the other day. We were talking about the problem that a lot of people have realized academic journals to be, you know, very, very valuable. People like to write into them. They get to say their thing. And so they've got a personal investedness. And there are companies which are just setting up hundreds and hundreds of journals. And there are various estimates of these journals which are just set up overnight, and they invite you to write and you feel all great and stuff. But that actually is quite difficult to disentangle and remove from, you know, what's out there in that giant library of crap, even though that's in the smaller pile of crap. Here's another term, which is supposedly academic. So there are a number of questions I would think there about how are we managing information anyway, which I'm not sure, you can tell me otherwise. It's kind of the problem we've got at the moment, except that, as you say, if I want to, I go to Wikipedia. I mean, I've seen people put on their profiles things like, I manage Wikipedia page for my company. And I'm like, are you really supposed to be managing the Wikipedia page for your company? People will do this. You will see different kinds of ways in SOLT protocol. So I'm wondering whether or not that's, perhaps you're not saying that, I'm wondering whether or not that is actually much different from the place we are about the notions and ideas that here we have all this information and it needs to be processed, it needs to be worked through. But we would have that anyway. The only thing is we have this extra thing that we know if it's been tampered with or not, which I think is actually an improvement if something's not contemporaneous. I mean, I used to be a special constable, and you can't just cross out entries because you just remember, oh, I know it wasn't that, and just go back and cross it out. But, you know, the evidential nature of the contemporaneous account, really, really important, and any tampering needs to be, you know, identified because that has its own credibility.
Right.
So that's the first thing I thought.
Well, before you go on,
Yeah.
so I always talk about the internet much in the same way as a library full of crap. But when we had nothing, we had libraries. Then we had the internet, and we had online, and we had lots and lots and lots of data online, and we couldn't find anything.
Yeah.
Then came search engines. So now I've got the ability to discover all there is to know about birds or whatever it is that I happen to be searching for, but it's just information about birds. And for as good as the Google search algorithm tends to be, it's not perfect. So after discovery is curation. So now I'm going to curate all of this information and put further categorization and further qualifications and actually kind of give it, okay, so now it's been curated information. And then the next evolution beyond that is meaning. So what happens after I've curated? So with all of this information, what does it mean? And that's how I'm seeing the evolution of internet data, from mass amounts of data to discovery, to curation, to meaning.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting as well. I wish you'd been at this thing. I challenged Noam Chomsky actually and said, I don't agree. I think that actually what we're looking at here is the internet more as a publishing platform. It is the ability to rapidly increase the rate and change. But, you know, you have people like Fermat, who was an amateur hobbyist kind of guy doing mathematics, but he would write to the institutions. And I'm not so sure that I agree. Or what do you think of my theory? And Fermat was able to engage and have a dialogue, but he was having that age. He had that stature and status, at least, that he was considered a reasonable person. He was saying very intelligent kind of things mathematicians could be bothered to answer and address. So I said that actually I thought this was a big opportunity for people to share ideas and actually make things better by exposure to other views. And I said, you know, Chomsky, you know, this is a thing that is, you started off doing papers and you're now in a very, very strong position. But you didn't get to that strong position by just repeating and learning off your own back. You got to that position because you were able to see the evolution and challenging of ideas. And because people, and it comes back to the history being written by the winners kind of thing. When I wrote a publication, well, I ran a project which is called The Glory of Failure, and from that came a book called The Failure Files. And one of the things is you can't easily bring someone who's failed to a conference to talk about their failure. You bring people who've like really made big achievements to talk about their history, about how they got there. Well, actually, it's the same with nations, isn't it? I go on and then I repeat and I look back. There's an expression in psychology that says, history is not reproductive. Sorry, history is reconstructive, not reproductive.
Mm.
Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. That is, we build that picture up. But the blockchain thing, the ability to say, no, this is not a temporable thing, means there is a degree of reproducibility. You can refer back to it. And I totally agree with your points about contextualization. And there are still going to be issues in terms of access and who writes and who can write and who writes in a way that people take notice of. Just to the second point about the ability to search through the thing, as I say, I feel it's kind of slightly separate, except that, of course, there's a degree to which you can't organize the data within itself without that being seen as a tamper. But I'm not sure that's desperately different from how we would deal with information now if we go look back at things like maybe the Wayback Machine, where the Wayback Machine was trying to code this and capture patterns, even if only a slight bit. But, there's still the facility to kind of, go and change that record and not be aware that there's been tampering, find ways to remove it, potentially get rid of it. I don't know if maybe the Wayback Machine is moving towards more of these kinds of ways. The second point I was going to say, unless you wanted to say anything more on that. So the second point I was going to say is, I in terms of history, looking at history in a bigger kind of longer term position, the study of history, historiography, and what a historian is supposed to do, in a sense, a question that comes before this notion about curation, about what it is that is the role or the purpose of history. So if you look at currently, we're sort of like looking into the past to try and establish an objective truth. We're trying to figure out what that is. And so things like authenticity. So I know that blockchain is being used to sort of like make sure that we've got authentic things. We could say, this is an authentic Leonardo da Vinci, or it's authentic thing that's going through. It's a validation. It gives
provenance.
Provenance, yes. We got there at the same time. You've got this provenance on there. But at the time of writing, when Shakespeare was around, the role of people, to my understanding, I kind of feel quite confident, but I'm not a historiographer. So my understanding was that history was not meant to be an objective account of the facts. It was supposed to be part of the way it was about a glorification of how things were. You look at Macbeth. Macbeth can't just die in his bed. He has to be a super traitor. And that serves the interests of the king who's present in the, who's actually there exploring and thinking about the kinds of, I expect my historians to give me the past. How did I get here was the role of historians. And in some myself, the challenge to myself in terms of what this could mean in terms of blockchain is, if we could record things, will we see a change in the role of the historian in terms of what's going on? And actually, I think probably the simpler question is the one that you put about contextualization. I don't know whether that's stored in metadata or if that's stored beyond the blockchain, or if that is stored in the blockchain, or a parallel thing to the blockchain. I'm not quite sure what that looks like, because you've only just sort of like raised it. Obviously, I recognise that context is very important in any of these things, and anyone who's been to school and hearing about Jane Austen's life probably does too. It's still kind of, it makes me think about whether the nature of history might, history study might change in the light of the recorded, and certainly things like, well, who tampered with it will be a question that be an interesting question for future historians to be asking. If the blockchain, we record a tamper, and maybe if we find a time when we think this cannot have happened, how did they tamper with it? I know there's discussions about taking, having enough power to reach whatever it is, 25% threshold to, is it 25% to,
Well, they talk in some protocols, they talk about the 51% attack.
Is it 51? Yeah, that's the one. As I say, I'm on the board. I have a bit of knowledge of this, but there's a certain level which you could tamper with the blockchain. Who can get that power?
Right. So
and these might be questions for future historians. And I think what I'm saying is really natures of provenance, natures of how we study history, objects for archaeologists, for anthropologists and stuff will change over time in that. And the history is written by the winners to come straight, right back to that is the indelibility has a particular level of mutability, has this particular feature which is very, very interesting. It compares more to things that I think about being more like, I guess, geological or cosmological events. We can't debate this. Look at its carbon content.
Right.
The carbon content. Although this is a manufactured carbon content. It's not based on the half-life and decay of these different things. we're actually able to insert this, or someone's able to insert this. And there'll still be mimicked power structures in society that will say, I get to write on the, well, assuming, I get to write on the main blockchain that historians are expected to study. Your book can be put in the back of the library, which is with Chomsky's crap, or whatever whatever the academic term is for it. So I guess within that, it's, as I say, the metadata, I don't know if metadata would be the way you're talking about context, or if you're talking about it more being the human technological, socio-technical system, the way in which that could be recorded, and so on.
So, all right. Again, you've asked a really kind of lovely, multifaceted sort of question.
Yeah.
Writing into a blockchain requires typically a digital signature to prove who was writing into the blockchain. Is it the person who they say they are? And do they actually have the authority to be able to make that particular entry? And that is separate and distinct from the context of the data being written. And I think I would use the word metadata of the source and the context of the information. One of my concepts that I talk a lot about is the minimum effective blockchain, because at the end of the day, a blockchain makes for a really lousy database. It makes for a really lousy file system. It's not searchable. It's one large flat file. And if you put too much data into it, and then you create multiple copies of it, it just gets unwieldy really fast. I mean, I would say you can make the comparison that a blockchain has some of the same characteristics as an Excel file. Right. And even though an Excel file, I can open it up and insert 8 terabytes of video from Game of Thrones and make 100 copies of the Excel file. Even though I could, I wouldn't. And kind of the blockchain is the same way. I can take the entire copy of War and Peace and I could write it onto the blockchain. I could, but I wouldn't. So then we come to the tangential question, and because we're a little short on time, I'm kind of jumping ahead of IPFS. So one of the distributed file systems is IPFS, and for those that have not heard it before, and I'm not making it up, it's the interplanetary file system, the IPFS. It was originally conceived for we have really extremely long latency. So when we colonize Mars and the speed of light still is not fast enough to get instant communication between Earth and Mars, how do we get a file system that will handle really long latency? But in practicality, it's distributed file system that has both read and write capability. So it's not an endlessly growing write once immutable file system at all. It is indeed a distributed file system, a lot like torrents, but it's flexible and you can read and write. And then you get a pointer to that and say that piece of data is stored on the IPFS and it's stored here. And what typically gets written into the blockchain is a digital signature of that document. So whether that's a song or a movie or a PDF document or an image, you can run a hash on that. And that gives you a digital signature for that document. They call it a one-way hash. So I can see every time I put that document in, I always get the same hash out. If I change even one bit in that document, I'll get a completely different hash. And I will know that it has changed. And then you write the document name, its location in IPFS, and its digital signature, and that's what gets written into the blockchain. And then you know if somebody has tampered with the original document, or you know if it really is a true and original document. But it's not like Microsoft Word. You can't track changes. There's no history of what was it before. All you can see is it exactly to the bit the same as it was on the day you wrote it and put its digital signature onto the blockchain. So the points I'm trying to make are, A, you have to sign everything that gets written into the blockchain, but that may or may not be by the person who's actually recording the history. B, metadata, yes, it will have source and context, and those will be written as part of this digital document. C, turns out that most blockchains don't want really, really large files, so you'll store them elsewhere, but put signatures, digital signatures of them onto the blockchain to prove whether or not it has or has not been tampered with. And that's the way I look at that.
Right. I mean, I raised the issue of IPFS with you earlier when I was talking about, well, my poor son who has to put up with every innovation that comes up being trialed on him. And I was using a messenger called Moin, and I think there's another one called PubSub. And I was trying out how to sort of like do communication. I've seen previous ones before and they've not really worked. But I also have been recently, because Brave Browser has incorporated into it something which is the IPFS climate links to, sorry, the IPFS sort of extension which links to IPFS on the desktop. I've been looking at how to try and put together my own mini network, I mean, within the bigger networks, and just exchanges with other people. And I think when I've looked at the technology behind it, and again, I mean, I do teach computing, so I should know like stuff about this. And I have got some sense, I mean, the idea of hashing and federated hashing in terms of how you might code information, what's similar, what's different, and so on. I was rather thinking, I don't understand why search within the IPFS is not problematic, based on the fact that, you know, blockchain, which I believe underlies it, does not seem to be, seems to be very problematic. Or have I got that wrong?
So there is no index of every single document that's stored in IPFS. And there is no way to actually search in IPFS at all, at least not that I'm aware of. Because really all it is it's, you know, based on a cryptocurrency such as Filecoin that either allows you to borrow someone else's disk space or to provide excess disk space and to be rewarded for supporting all of that. And so there is no kind of, I'm going to search the IPFS for all evidences of coronavirus cures. That doesn't even exist. If you didn't write it, you would never have the index for it. And then separate and distinct,
I think the file system.
Yeah, file system, internet.
It's the phrase file system that makes me think. You have a file system, you have a kind of a formatting of a file system is the kind of conception I have with a master, you know, file. You know, you have a file table which references bits. And
yes, you would have that.
It's just maybe the word that's possibly deceiving me, because I would think of the nature of a file system as necessarily.
Well, so if I have the address or the name of the file in the IPFS, you're right. There has to be a table to go and look up and say, where is that stored? Where is that stored on Mary's computer, and go and find it? So that kind of indexing exists, but actually going out and indexing the contents of the IPFS.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, as I say, it's relatively new. I've seen it sort of like been developing. I really like the first comment on the Git list for IPFS, which says from small thing, you know, all big things start small or something like that. And I think to myself, this is probably one of the biggest innovations potentially from the stuff that I've seen applications and discussions over. But I haven't managed to sort of like really get a grip and a handle on how it works yet, to sort of like really be able to advise somebody or to sort of like try see whether or not it is that big thing. And I think I'm generally very positive about trying out any tech, very open-minded, but I'm also very skeptical at the moment. I think, you know, this is not, you know, this isn't the big thing that people are making out and so on. So yeah, still exploring that place. The potential that I see is massive, but I think, you know, as I say, it seems very complex, and perhaps some of the problem has been, you know, as you've explained, this idea about hearing the world. I mean, the interplanetary bit is cool, but the bit about file system has made me think more about traditional file systems and the ways in which, you know, HFS might differ from NTFS and stuff. And it's this kind of click between how that is relating to blockchain and the discussions that I think there have been other discussions which are about how it relates to bit torrenting and how torrenting has been connected together. I mean, it's clearly way beyond the scope of this, but, you know, it's really helpful for you to, you know, sort of like knock me out of like a particular line of thinking about seeing it as a file system that I might be used to on a regular day-by-day basis, and trying to imagine a kind of like more direct slotting in of blockchain into that kind of thing, and so on. So yeah, thank you.
You're most welcome. And I always applaud the experimentation. So I do another podcast called The Wicked Podcast with my co-host Marcus Kirsch. And we talk a lot about the value of experimentation and how organizations, large and small, benefit when individuals and teams and entire divisions do small experiments and learn along the way. So we're out of time today. I really do appreciate you spending some time with me on a Friday afternoon. So hope you enjoyed the show.
No, definitely. It's really great having the chance to sort of discuss it. And hopefully some of this will be interesting to people around me. I get a few less inquiries about the suitability of blockchain for how it could look after their pets and stuff, but other than the little microchip markers. You know, it's really interesting. I'm glad to sort of hear a bit about the IPFS in particular. So thank you very much for everything.
Great. Well, have a great weekend, and thank you. Bye now.
Take care. Bye.
Hi, this is Troy again from SER Team. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Jonathan Jewell. In the comments below, be sure and leave questions for either Jonathan or for myself. Also, let me know of other people that you think would be good to have on the show. They can ask a question and I can tell them my view on blockchain and the wider technology space. Be sure and check the show notes for contact information for Jonathan and myself. And otherwise, have a great weekend.